No flame, no flame. This is a legitimate, serious question. So please don't just join in just to comment, oh yeah, I knew the game was dying since they did that thing back in Wrath of the Lich King when I quit. Yeah, I agree, after they did that thing in Legion, I uninstalled and never played again. Talking seriously, this is a question that came up when trying to look up some numbers for a different kind of video, but looking at those numbers made me question, maybe made me wonder about the situation right now. For example, one of the first numbers you can look at is the current amount of population in Mythic Plus. Since we don't have the real numbers from Blizzard anymore, we haven't had them in a while, we can still try to gauge some numbers by, for example, looking at the unique characters completing a Mythic Plus key. And up to patch 10.1.5 of Season 2, the number is 2.5 million. Now, if you compare this to Dragonflight Season 1, the number is 6.7. So you went from 6.7 to 2.5, which is like a 2.5 times drop of unique characters in Mythic Plus. Now we have comparisons. We have comparisons because, for example, we can go back to Shadowlands and notice that between Season 1, which had 8.2 million, and Season 2, which is 4 million, it's a 50% drop of player base, which is not nearly as big as what we have now. We also have an even smaller drop from BFA Season 1, which is 4.9 million, to BFA Season 2, which is 4.3. So a very small drop in player base between Season 1 and Season 2 of BFA. Then I started thinking what's going on in the raid. Because, for example, if you look at the first tier of this expansion, let's not look at Mythic raiding because that's, too small of a part of the player base to draw some numbers. You can look at Heroic to see a much larger player base. If you go past the middle, besides the first freebie bosses, how many guilds, how many players went past the middle of the raid? It was, 13,500 in the first tier of this expansion compared to the first tier of Shadowlands, which was Castelnatria. It's not 13,500, it's 30,000 in Castelnatria. And then the tier before, which was Uldir, it's 27,000. Same goes for the second tier. The second tier of BFA was Battle of Zalor with 16,000. The second tier of Sanctum was 17,000, and now the second tier of Aberrus is 11. So in basically both Mythic Plus and the raid, you have seen a quite significant drop of players, more so in Mythic Plus compared to the raid. And perhaps one of the most common answers could be right now, for example, that, 10.1.5 came in, broke all of Mythic Plus, and now nobody wants to play because there is just Exodia dominating everywhere, which, makes sense on a first glance, but when you think about it, the numbers of the players in Season 2 before 10.1.5 was still on track to be a third of the players of Season 1. Well before patch 10.1.5 came through and warped the meta of Mythic Plus. So even that is not, it's not quite the full excuse or the full reason as to what is happening right now when it comes to the numbers. Now, what I found interesting about this and made me wonder, made me question the situation is that if you think about it, most players, I don't want to talk for everyone, but I would say the majority of players would be, I would say, content, maybe even almost happy with the rate and the speed and the amount of content being released in this expansion's patches. This is the expansion where we are starting to get in between patches, so patches like 10.0.5 or 10.1.5 and now 10.1.7 coming out in a week, where, actual content, right? We're not getting a full patch with just a selfie camera as an actual addition to the game. We're actually getting additions, extras, new game modes, new systems, etc., being introduced into the game, whether it is things like adding the trading post, adding things like dragon riding races, adding more bits of stories or game modes like the time rifts or the upcoming dream surges, reworks of specs and classes coming in between patches, etc, etc. So you would be thinking that given the speed of the content being released, more players would be satisfied with the content available. When you compare this with the wasteland, the empty, barren desert that was the speed of patches in Shadowlands, there is a massive difference. Daily reminder to everyone who forgot that Shadowlands now holds the record of the slowest release and the longest gap between the release of the expansion and the first patch, because Shadowlands was released at the end of November and 9.1 came out on July the 6th. So we are talking about 7+ months before even getting the first patch even out of the expansion. So the gap in content is of course much shorter in this expansion, and you have presumably way more things to do. So you would be thinking that the player base would have more reasons to stay, busy, to stay entertained in the game. But once all is said and done, even though sure, fine, these numbers are not definitive, they are not really telling the full story of the amount of the players, etc, etc. There are always some, asterisks here and there, etc, etc. But you can still try to draw a few conclusions based on these numbers. Now, there might also be attached to this question as to why there are seemingly at least fewer players, some other caveats, perhaps also known as cope angles, some copium takes, like for example, we are getting through the summer. We have, more players interested in doing other things, going on vacation, taking a break from staying inside, etc, etc. You also have gotten the release of the later patch 10.1 and then 10.1.5 into the release of other anticipated games, for example, whether it was earlier on Overwatch 2, into Diablo 4, into Baldur's Gate, into now eventually Path of Exile, etc, etc. So maybe you have gotten more players drawn in to be busy somewhere else, for example. But it is still overall an interesting thing to think about without having to be necessarily negative. I am one of those players, apparently it's not even that much of a widespread take, who believes that there is nothing wrong when playing an MMO or one of those, always online, always growing your character or your profile every day type of game, who believes that, if you're bored for a while, if you're bored for a bit, you can just stop playing, you can just go and enjoy something else, and then when you are interested again, you can come back. So I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but it's interesting that in the expansion where there might have been the largest amount and also more importantly the fastest amount of content being released, it is also simultaneously the one where it seems like the player numbers are getting lower faster, compared at the very least to the numbers of the modern version of the game, from Legion to BFA to Shadowlands and now to Dragonflight. We will of course see how things will be changing in about a couple of months, so likely from now until then this situation will likely continue. Not many players will have too many reasons in coming back until we start seeing the content available in 10.2 and what's gonna come in 10.2, etc, etc. So after that patch releases, we will be able to see the growth, how many players were able to get interested back into the game. But for now, I guess we are left with this question of why the expansion with so much more and faster content releases doesn't seem to be doing nearly as well as expected at the very least. So I'm going to leave you with this question mark down in the comments. What do you think is the problem right now? If you think it's perhaps just a problem of maybe when the game is being released, maybe the type of content being released, maybe the competition of other games, maybe the loss of trust of players towards Blizzard, created perhaps by the damages done by Shadowlands, for example. One of these many possible reasons, whichever you may think, it's the issue right now. But besides this, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your yet another reset of WoW on this Wednesday. So, with these things out of the way, we are starting as usual our goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. Help which can still be given, as always, for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. So, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, now, interesting question or not, it's still time to go eat, because I have forgotten once again to be eating, and I'm now about 4 hours late on my dinner.